Good evening. For decades, a family believed their son was buried at the Santa Fe National Cemetery.
But his remains recently turned up somewhere else. It had the Army exhuming a grave today to find out who really has been buried there. News 13's Rachel Knapp reports.
A major shift in World War II happened after the Japanese defeated American and Filipino troops on the Philippine Islands in 1942. Those troops were sent on the infamous Bataan Death March to the Japanese POW camp. One of the 2,800 prisoners who died in the camp was Private First Class Juan Gutierrez.
PFC Gutierrez passed away on November 19th, 1942. There were 13 other people that passed away on that date. They were all buried in one grave.
After the war ended, the military believed they found Gutierrez's remains and sent them back to his family, who buried him here at the Santa Fe National Cemetery in 1950. Years later, when DNA analysis became a useful tool to identify soldiers' remains, the Department of Defense came across more of Gutierrez's remains in a mass grave in the Philippines. So, who was buried in his grave in Santa Fe?
It was during that time frame that the Department of Defense realized that there was commingling amongst those remains.
In order to find out, the Army had to petition the courts to exhume the grave since they couldn't find any of Gutierrez's immediate family. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs eventually agreed to do the disinterment, which crews began working on today.
We have to separate out the remains that are in that casket that aren't Gutierrez's, and then so it's kind of like putting a puzzle back together.
The military hopes to finally put Gutierrez's and the other soldiers' remains to rest and will give them full military honors when they are reburied.
You have to do the moral thing.
Rachel Knapp, KRQE, News 13.
The military tells us they eventually found Gutierrez's family in California and they gave permission to exhume the grave. We're told about 37,000 soldiers' remains are still unaccounted for from World War II.
Welcome to Stories of Sacrifice, World War II American POW-MIAs in the Philippines. This is a production of the U.S. POW-MIA Family Locating. I'm your host and lead researcher, John Barrett.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Welcome to today's Story of Sacrifice podcast. Today we want to bring you a story that's very near and dear to our hearts because it's a case that we personally worked on. The wrong remains buried by the wrong family. Another misidentification, the case of Private First Class Juan F. Gutierrez. Mistakes are a fact of life. What counts is the response to the errors. Ever wonder why the U.S. government does not want to identify the missing from World War II? Listen on. The U.S. government expends great effort in telling the public how hard they work to recover the remains of American service members from all the wars. Yet they expend even greater effort in avoiding actually recovering and identifying those remains. The Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency's Public Affairs Office seems to produce more than the identification laboratory. Like many things the government does, it makes no sense until one knows all the circumstances. Last week we told you the story about Private Arthur H. Bud Kelder and his family struggled to bring his remains home for burial. Many of the listeners found it unbelievable that the U.S. government would obstruct the return of the remains of American service members. The story is that Bud was one of 14 Americans imprisoned in Cabanatuan POW camp in the Philippine Islands who died on November 19, 1942. All 14 were buried in a communal grave, number 717 in the camp cemetery. After the war, American forces opened the cemetery and moved the remains to a temporary cemetery known as Manila No. 2. One man was quickly identified on the basis of a dog tag found with his remains. 3 more were identified from dental records subsequently received from the states. The remaining 10 were ultimately buried as unknowns in the Manila American Cemetery. Their families were told only that their sons' remains were non-recoverable, with no explanation of what that meant. The implication was that no remains existed, as the Army had never even hinted that they may be part of a group burial. To the families of these unknowns, it was like they had fallen off the face of the earth, and the Army wasn't sharing with what they knew. In 2010, a member of Bud's family sought records of his death from the Army, who happily obliged and provided the file. It was immediately obvious from the records that Bud was one of 10 unknowns buried in Manila, but which one? The Army had been quite cooperative in providing the personnel file, but dug in their heels when the burial records that would identify an individual were requested. A nerve had obviously been hit, and the government was finished cooperating. It took a trip to federal court to obtain the record under Freedom of Information Act. The records were obviously releasable, but the government lawyers presented numerous extraneous objections in order to delay public release of the records known as X-Files. Fortunately, Bud's older brother, Dr. Herman Kelder, a dentist, left behind an oral history tape that mentioned that Bud had extensive gold dental work. It took 3 years and a federal lawsuit to obtain the records of the 10 unknowns from grave 717, but only one of them, X816, was shown to have any gold dental work. This should have been a slam dunk identification based on substantially better evidence than any of the World War II era identifications. But the family's requests for the remains were either rebuffed or totally ignored by any and all government agencies involved. And a sadly morbid side note, while the gold dental work was detailed on the first dental chart made when the remains were recovered from Cabanatuan Cemetery, all the precious metals subsequently disappeared from the remains. So much for protection of the remains by the Army. At least the dental record remained for the identification of the remains. It was later shown that not only had no other unknowns from Manila been identified in modern times, but perhaps more tellingly, documents surfaced showing that the government agencies had not only knew the identities of the remains, but they were also aware of the government's incompetence and misconduct. The government knew they had a problem. Actually, they had many problems, and they were of their own making. They definitely did not want to open this Pandora's box. It took another trip to federal court before the unknowns from grave 717 were disinterred for identification. Right from the beginning, almost if by design, they had made a mess of the recovery of remains from Cabanatuan POW camp. The prisoners had secretly kept extensive records of deaths and burials. However, unlike other POW camp burial records, such as Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan burial records, did not record each man's position in the communal grave. Not to be bothered by little details, the grave's registration personnel assumed that, like other camps, the burials were in roster sequence, so they officially identified the remains on the basis of their sequence in the burial roster. After several hundred remains had been transferred from Cabanatuan to Manila Cemetery No. 2 and buried under the incorrect name determined from the burial roster sequence, the mistake was realized and all the disinterment reports were corrected. All the records were corrected except the cemetery burial record. So as to dental records were obtained and compared with the skeletal remains, more identifications were made. Unfortunately, as the remains were identified, the cemetery was told to ship the remains previously misidentified on basis of the burial roster sequence. So while some mother's son had been identified, some other mother's son's remains were shipped to her for burial in the States. But this wasn't the worst of it. For some, as yet unexplained reason, the Graves Registration Command in the Philippines refused to employ any trained personnel to properly reassociate the remains, preferring instead to the use of contract civilian embalmers. While there is no indication that the remains were commingled in the communal graves, the untrained embalmers diligently sorted the remains based on color and size and hopelessly commingled the remains. In the case of Bud Kelder, for example, a few token bones returned to his family have come from 5 different caskets. It is not improbable that a bit of each of the 14 men were present in each of the 14 caskets. While each of these problems might be attributed to honest mistakes, it is the response to the error that counts. If the mistakes were sad, the government response was totally shameful. Not only were multiple government agencies aware of the mistakes that many, perhaps most families had received the remains of some other family's son, but they worked to continue to cover up and to this day diligently fight any request to return the remains. In a final display of incompetence in Grave 717 case, the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency was unable to locate a family member to consent to the exhumation of Private First Class Gutierrez, and finally asked a federal judge to allow them to proceed. A private individual, which was myself, using only publicly available data, was able to locate a close family member in less than 1 hour of research. Now, more than 3 years after the last occupant of Grave 717 was exhumed for identification, a few token remains from each man has been identified and returned to their respective families for burial. The Kelder family, after 4 trips to federal court, is believed to have received the largest amount of remains, about 10 large bones. The balance of the remains, which were virtually complete when exhumed from Cabanatuan, will likely be cremated and disposed of regardless of each family's religious beliefs. So how does a crack government agency screw up so often with such consequences without learning anything? It looks like the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency has a long heritage of incompetence. Cabanatuan Grave 717 was the first of a handful of similar cases disinterred for identification, but it was not in the least atypical, either in the facts or the government's effort to conceal their incompetence. Rather than leverage what they had learned from Grave 717, the DPAA continues to find new ways to avoid identifying the more than 1,000 unknowns from the Cabanatuan POW
Overall,
camp.
thank you for listening to Stories of Sacrifice, World War II American POW-MIAs in the Philippines. This has been a production of the US POW-MIA Family Locating. You can find us on the web at uspowmiafamilylocating.com. Opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and given in the best intention. Overall, the POW-MIA accounting community is doing what it can with limited resources. It is our hope additional federal funding will be provided, along with additional partnerships established to disinter and process the remains of our unknowns located in the national cemeteries. You can help by contacting your congressional representatives and asking that they implement a DNA lead policy for those unknown POW-MIAs. Thank you for listening.